Now let me give you the information environment dimension, because the Parliament's acknowledgement is only comprehensible in the context of an information environment that has been changing in ways the regime has been unable to fully control. Iran's internet shutdowns during the protests were designed to prevent the documentation and sharing of information that contradicts the official narrative. The shutdowns work, partially. They slow the spread of information. They prevent real-time coordination. They make it harder for protesters to organize and harder for journalists to document. But they do not prevent information from existing. Iranians with satellite internet, with VPNs, with access to Telegram channels operated by exile organizations, which is to say, a significant and growing portion of the Iranian urban population, have access to information about the war's actual progress that the official media does not provide. The Iran International, reporting on the contested succession, the documentation of protest deaths by human rights organizations, the financial data showing the blockade's economic impact, the satellite imagery of struck nuclear facilities that anyone with an internet connection can access. The parliamentarian who broke ranks was not operating in an information vacuum. He was operating in a context where the gap between the official narrative and the available information was large enough that maintaining the narrative required increasingly visible and increasingly costly acts of suppression, where the silence of senior clerics about the legitimacy of Mojtaba Khamenei's succession was itself a form of information available to anyone paying attention, where the jeering of IRGC officers in Isfahan streets was being filmed and uploaded faster than the disruption teams could suppress it. In that information environment, the official narrative's maintenance cost was rising. Every parliamentarian who knew the real picture was calculating whether the cost of maintaining the narrative, the complicity in a deception that was becoming increasingly transparent, was worth the institutional protection that compliance provided. The parliamentarian who spoke had concluded it was not, and his conclusion, spoken on the record in the Iranian parliament, invited every other parliamentarian who had made the same private calculation to make it public. That invitation is what makes the admission so consequential. Not the single statement. The opening it creates for a cascade of acknowledgments from people who had been privately aware of the reality and publicly maintaining the narrative. Cascades, in authoritarian political systems, are the mechanism through which official narratives collapse, not gradually, suddenly. After a long period of private knowledge and public silence, a single break in the silence creates the conditions for the second break, which creates the conditions for the third, until the narrative that everyone was privately disbelieving collapses publicly in a way that can no longer be reconstructed. Iran may be at the beginning of that cascade. The parliament's admission may be the first break, or it may be a solitary statement that the IRGC suppresses before it can cascade. The direction depends on how many other parliamentarians, how many other officials, how many other institutional actors have been privately calculating the same conclusion and are now watching to see whether the first break produces consequences or creates space. Now, let me give you what admitting the war is lost actually opens, because the parliament's admission is not just a statement about the past. It is an opening toward a possible future that the regime has been unable to articulate as long as the official narrative required the pretense of victory. Admitting the war is lost opens the negotiating space for a settlement on terms that stop the bleeding. The blockade, costing $500 million per day, cannot continue indefinitely without destroying the economic foundations of the Islamic Republic. The military campaign's damage to Iranian nuclear and conventional military capability is real, but not necessarily irreversible over time, if the pressure eases. The protests in 31 provinces are a symptom of economic conditions that a functioning economy, freed from blockade constraints, could begin to address. A settlement that acknowledges the war's strategic outcome, Iranian concessions on nuclear capabilities, in exchange for the end of the military campaign and a path to sanctions relief, is the only available path to stabilizing the economic conditions that are producing the protests that are threatening the regime's survival. The IRGC's resistance doctrine says this path is forbidden. The parliament's admission says this path is necessary. And the gap between those two positions is the central political contest inside Iran right now. The unthinkable happened. Parliament admitted the war is lost. And in admitting it, it opened a door that the IRGC has been trying to keep closed. Whether Iran walks through that door, and whether the pressure for a settlement overcomes the IRGC's resistance to the concessions a settlement requires, will determine not just the outcome of this war, but the future of the Islamic Republic itself. That determination is happening now, in the parliament, in the IRGC command structure, in the office of a supreme leader whose legitimacy is contested and whose institutional position depends on navigating a conflict between the civilian government and the military institution that both nominally report to him. The war may be lost. The parliament said so. What comes next is whether the Islamic Republic can survive losing it. Stay with me. Let me add the global dimension, because the Iranian parliament's admission that the war is lost is not just an Iranian domestic story. It is a signal received by every government that has been calculating what the Iran war's outcome means for the broader strategic contest. Russia received the signal with the specific concern of a government whose strategic relationship with Iran rested on the assumption that Iran's resistance would hold. Moscow has been providing Iran with diplomatic cover, with economic support through the sanctions-busting trade relationships that have kept the Iranian economy functioning below its potential but above collapse. A post-surrender Iran, an Iran that has conceded the nuclear restrictions that the military campaign demanded, is a different strategic partner than the Iran that Russia signed its comprehensive cooperation agreements with. The question for Moscow is whether a post-war Iran, freed from the most severe sanctions pressure in exchange for nuclear concessions, becomes more valuable as a partner because it has more economic capacity, or less valuable because it has demonstrated that American military pressure can produce Iranian strategic retreat. China's calculation is more commercial and more complicated. The $400 billion cooperation framework assumed an Iran whose strategic posture was resistant, whose conflict with the West created the conditions for Chinese investment to fill gaps that Western companies could not fill under sanctions. A post-war Iran that reaches accommodation with the West creates different conditions. The gaps that Chinese investment was filling may shrink. The leverage that Iran's isolation gave Beijing in the relationship may diminish. And in the Arab Gulf states, in Riyadh, in Abu Dhabi, in Doha, the parliament's admission is being read as confirmation of something that Gulf analysts have been privately saying for months, that the Islamic Republic, for the first time in its history, is negotiating from a position of genuine strategic weakness, that the combination of military damage, internal unrest, economic devastation, and diplomatic isolation has produced a moment when the Gulf state's most powerful and most threatening neighbor is not in a position to escalate, to threaten, to project the regional power that has defined Iranian foreign policy since 1979. That moment is one that Gulf states will not want to waste. The diplomatic and security architecture they have been trying to build, the relationships with China, the normalized ties with Israel, the American security guarantees, has more room to consolidate in a period when Iran is focused on internal stabilization than in a period when Iran is capable of regional destabilization. The parliament's admission that the war is lost is not just a domestic Iranian political event, it is a regional signal, a global signal, received by every government that has a stake in what comes next in the Middle East. And what comes next, in Iran, in the region, in the contest between American power and the alternative order that China, Russia, and Iran have been trying to build, is being shaped right now by the admission that a parliamentarian in Tehran made when he stood up and said what everyone already knew: the war is lost, and the world is adjusting to that reality. Stay with me. May 2026, the Iranian parliament, Tehran. A member rose to speak, not an opposition figure. There are no real opposition figures in the Iranian parliament. A member of the regime's own political establishment. A man who had spent his career inside the system, supporting the system, defending the system against its critics. He stood up. And he said what no Iranian official had said publicly in the entire duration of the war. The war cannot be won on current terms. Iran must pursue a political solution. The continuation of the current strategy is producing outcomes that serve neither the Islamic Republic nor the Iranian people. The room went quiet. Not because the statement was surprising to the people in that room. They all knew it. Every Iranian parliamentarian who had access to real information about the state of the war, the state of the economy, the state of the IRGC's military position, had known for weeks that the official narrative of heroic resistance was not matching the operational reality. What was surprising was that someone had said it out loud, in the parliament, on the record, and once it was said, it could not be unsaid. Tonight, I want to work through 4 things. First, what does it mean strategically when a regime's own legislative body acknowledges that the war is lost? And what does the acknowledgement tell us about how the information environment inside Iran has changed? Second, what is the operational reality of Iran's military position that the parliament was actually acknowledging, and how does it differ from the official narrative? Third, what happens to a government's domestic legitimacy when the gap between official narrative and acknowledged reality becomes impossible to maintain? And fourth, what does admitting the war is lost actually open up, and why the admission may be both the most honest and the most dangerous thing the Iranian parliament has done? Stay with me. Because when a regime's own parliament breaks ranks with the official narrative, the narrative itself becomes the casualty. And narratives, in authoritarian states, are not decorative. They are structural. They hold the edifice together. When they fail, what follows is not simply embarrassment. It is institutional crisis. Let me start with what the parliament was actually acknowledging. Because the gap between Iran's official war narrative and the operational reality has been enormous for months. And understanding that gap is the only way to understand why a parliamentarian finally said what everyone already knew. Iran's official narrative of the war described a heroic resistance against American and Israeli aggression. Nuclear facilities struck, described as temporary setbacks that Iran would overcome through indigenous technical capability. Military commanders killed, described as martyrs whose sacrifice would inspire greater resistance. The blockade, described as illegal economic warfare that Iran was successfully circumventing through alternative trade channels. The protests, described as foreign instigated destabilization that the security forces were managing effectively. The operational reality: Iran's nuclear program had been set back by years. Key facilities were destroyed or damaged beyond rapid repair. The delivery systems that would have weaponized whatever fissile material Iran had accumulated were degraded. The IRGC had lost commanders at a rate that damaged its operational planning capacity. The blockade was costing $500 million per day in losses that Iran's economy, already stressed by decades of sanctions, could not absorb indefinitely. The protests were spreading to 31 provinces and requiring lethal force to suppress, a force that was consuming IRGC domestic capacity at the same time that the institution was managing an external military commitment. That is not a narrative of heroic resistance. That is the operational picture of a state that has absorbed significant military damage, is under severe economic pressure, is experiencing its most serious internal unrest since the revolution, and whose diplomatic insurance, BRICS solidarity, Russian and Chinese backing, has proven insufficient to offset the pressure. Every parliamentarian with access to real intelligence reporting knew this picture. They had known it for weeks. The official narrative had been maintained not because the people maintaining it believed it, but because acknowledging the reality meant acknowledging that the strategy had failed. And acknowledging that the strategy had failed meant acknowledging that the costs the Iranian people had been asked to bear, the economic hardship, the isolation, the deaths, had been imposed in service of a strategy that did not achieve its objectives. The parliamentarian who spoke did not just break the official narrative. He broke the political protection that the narrative provided. He forced into the public record the acknowledgement that the costs were real, the losses were real, and the strategy had not produced the outcomes it promised. That acknowledgement is what makes the admission so dangerous for the regime.